Our guest today is one of the leading strategic thinkers in the world, a man who knows the Middle East more than most, former head of CIA and former commander of CENTCOM, General David Petraeus is with us. Also, Hamas tests the nerves of Israelis yet again. There's a new president in Washington in 10 days, and the Mensch Award is something to look forward to if you're interested in AI. It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. It's unholy, two Jews on the news. A tiny bit of news about us. It's 4 years we've been doing this. How the world has changed in those 4 years in so many ways. But we ourselves have changed a little bit because, as you know, we have recently expanded the love and the circle with our friends and family subscription offer, in which you can be a friend of the podcast, you can be a family member of the podcast, and if you do that, you will be eligible for our bonus episodes. I'm mentioning all that partly because we're doing something a bit different with one of our bonus episodes that is upcoming, and that is the kind of format of a book club where everyone says, okay, this is the book, everyone reads it, and you come together to talk about it. We're going to do that with different things, but I think our first one is with a movie, a film that is loved by your two co-hosts. We've talked about it quite a bit on the podcast, but never fully, never properly. It is When Harry Met Sally, 35 and a bit years old, an absolute stone cold masterpiece. If you haven't seen it, make sure to see it in the next week or 10 days, 2 weeks or so that you can then hear, if you are a subscriber, our special bonus episode talking all about When Harry Met Sally. Greatest romantic comedy ever made, possibly one of the greatest films ever made, Yonit. I don't know.
Indeed, and the most not declared Jewish film of all time. We'll get into that in our episode as well. You kind of breezed through the fact that January 15th, 2021 was the first Unholy episode. We are fast approaching January 15th, 2025, which is, listeners, 3 years and 10 months more than what Jonathan Friedland thought this podcast would last. Every day since is a bonus with you, Johnny Friedland. So
yes.
Just mention that, I think, right off the bat.
Yeah, I think 3 years, 10 months, and maybe 2 weeks longer. I think I gave it 6 weeks to 2 months, but here we still are. And that's, I think, obviously...
The power of Israeli stubbornness.
Well, that's a part of it. That's definitely been part of it. I think the other thing, I was just going to doff my cap to the listeners, because I think it's the listeners and their response to what we're doing here, that has made it, last like this. When we began, I was on that as podcasting was all new, and I did imagine you and I sort of into the ether a bit. And instead, we've found, tens of thousands of people who are listening to what we're doing and have indeed become part of our circle with our friends and with our family members.
Indeed. And look, a lot has changed, but we were talking then right before President Biden's inauguration, and now we're talking right before Donald Trump's second inauguration. We'll get to that in a minute, but I do need to, we have so many listeners in the Los Angeles area. Our heart goes out to our friends and our listeners there. It is really, you look at the pictures of the wildfires from, the Palisades and the rest of the region. It's really terrible what's been going on there. I had this strange moment where I've been writing my friends who live in LA to ask if they're okay, and them writing back, and I kind of needed to figure out what was that eerie feeling, and I realized that for a year and 3 months they have been writing me constantly to see if I'm okay, and suddenly the tables have turned on this. Yeah,
no, that's a real turnaround. There have been moments in those in the last 18 months, just occasionally, when the traffic is in reverse. But this is one of those moments. And, since we mentioned When Harry Met Sally, Billy Crystal, among the people whose homes are reportedly or have reportedly been destroyed. And so, we send sympathy to anybody affected by this. And if you're there and you're listening to us, we're grateful to have you with us. I just thought, actually, the coincidence of these terrible wildfires in the days leading up to Donald Trump just are an example of how the politics is going to change. Because right now he can do the usual thing he does, which is blaming everyone else and saying what a bad job everyone else who's not him does. Particularly if that everyone is the governor of California, right? Who's someone that
Trump has targeted more than once.
Absolutely. I mean, Gavin Newsom will be a kind of dartboard for Republicans over the coming period. There are fewer of them because Democrats don't really hold power anywhere, nationally. So they really have to hunt for people they can blame. And they will. I just think there's going to be that fascinating thing that happens where the economy is terrible, the worst economy you've ever seen. The country's in a Great Depression until 11:59 a.m. on January the 20th, and then suddenly Donald Trump's in charge, and he'll be saying, "We're the envy of the world, we're the greatest country, and it's all down to me." And so he's still the challenger in this period, and he can just blame everything on everyone else. But suddenly, not necessarily this problem, but problems like this are going to be his problem, and the politics is going to be very dramatically changed very, very soon.
Yeah. I mean, and the interesting, I might be quite naive about this, but I mean, this is a disaster, what is happening in the Los Angeles area, right? There are 5 dead and 2,000 structures burned, 100,000 people under evacuation orders, but everything has been politicized, right? So now what you have is the right, particularly Donald Trump himself, blaming, as we said, Gavin Newsom for the fact that there's no water in the hydrants in LA, and you see this sort of attack of the right against the left, and kind of using this as an example for the blue state dysfunction. And to me, it always seems, and this happens in Israel as well, right? And you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, there are people terrified trying to get their families out of a wildfire zone, a disaster zone. How about we push politics aside for just a few days until you get this under control? It's not that I don't think that people who are responsible should be held accountable, but I do think that this kind of politicizing of disasters, and again, as I say, I'm sitting here as an Israeli, it happens here all the time, certainly when it comes to October 7th, is something that I wish, that humanity could wait for a day or two before this disaster becomes political fodder.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, it's really good politics as well to not be engaged in the blame game and instead just be dealing with the problem. It's a bit like, when people say the best mode of sort of rhetoric is sincerity, if you actually say we're putting all politics aside and we're going to work with people to solve a problem, voters love that. So to be non-political is really good politics. And yet it's funny how often politicians don't realize that and go straight into the bear pit of blame, adding to people's current worries. Talking of politics and politicians, outside of that immediate issue, it's all going on in this period of sort of countdown to the inauguration. We know Donald Trump said, I want all of this dealt with, meaning all of the different Middle East, fronts by January the 20th. Get yourselves in order, get your act together before I swear that oath. How's that working out?
Well, that's a polite way of putting it. Get your act together. He said basically all hell will break loose if the hostages are not released before January 20th. This echoes, and we talked about it last episode when we discussed Jimmy Carter. This really does echo that moment where they're both on their way, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, on the way to Reagan's inauguration, January 20th of 1980, and the hostages, American hostages held in Iran, are released. A lot of people are asking themselves, are we heading towards the same kind of moment? Sadly, as we sit here now, I think we're not. There were signs this week like something is moving forward. We should also note that the special envoy of the president, Steve Witkoff, who is a real estate mogul, he is on his way to Doha for the first time to be part of these negotiations. I would just put this asterisk next to this fact. Until the head of Mossad, Dadi Barnea, is on his way to Doha, and he isn't as we speak here on Thursday, it means that things aren't moving as quickly as we could hope for. There was this moment this week where Hamas, in its enduring cruelty and tugging at every nerve of Israeli society, leaked a list that actually Israel had written in the summer of 34 hostages without saying that they agree to release them, and then without saying who is dead and who is alive. Just imagine what that does to the families. And of course, we saw this harrowing video of Liri Elbag, one of the Outlook soldiers, one of the 5 still held by Hamas. she was abducted in her pajamas on October 7th from the military base of Nahal Oz. They put her in military uniform to signal that she is a soldier begging for her life. And of course, the other development is that Yusuf el-Ziyadna, a Bedouin who was working in Kibbutz Cholit and also abducted, his body was found in Gaza. Probably his son, too, Hamza, we should mention his two other children, Bilal and Aisha, were released in the hostage deal. I'm saying all this, Jonathan, because I don't think we should be looking at January. I actually think, and this is a tragic thing to say when every minute counts, I think we should be looking at March. And March is a moment, because if we know something about Benjamin Netanyahu, we know he will not make a decision 1 minute before he needs to, right? He likes to delay his decisions as much as possible. March is the moment where Israel has to pass the budget and the exemption from military service, because the ultra-Orthodox will not vote for the budget unless there is that kind of bill. And if he decides to go for a hostage deal, he knows that he's actually going for elections. That is when we will know. If he doesn't pass that law, if the budget doesn't pass, we will know that Netanyahu decided to go for a hostage deal. Tragically, that's a very long wait from now.
I mean, tragically is the word. Imagine how painful for those hostage families to hear what you said there, which I know is right, which is he doesn't make a decision until he absolutely has to. They will be thinking, you absolutely have to now. Not for political reasons, but for the lives of these hostages. And the news of that hostage father and probably his son, the Bedouin father and son, adds, the number of living hostages is going down. We don't know if it's each passing week or day, but that number that was, once in 3 figures is now in 2 figures. How is that not a decision that he has to take now? But absolutely, you're right. Politically, it's about what's suiting him, and that timetable is different. And, I think the focus moving to March is glum news for those hostages, but I'm afraid all too plausible. It does mean that the bluff of Donald Trump in some ways is going to be called, because he said all hell, as you said, will be unleashed if I don't get these hostages. I always wondered, well, what kind of hell exactly? What exactly would you do? Given you're a guy who doesn't want to use force and doesn't want to start wars, you want to end them. What would he actually do? I think by a few weeks' time, we may see that was in some ways a hollow threat. And so that's yet another, consequence that is being laid bare.
The only time that threat works is before January 20th.
Exactly. It's a bluff that should never be called. And I think for the reasons you've just absolutely rightly explained, I think it will be. Trump also, does he do these things carelessly or doesn't he? You'd need a sort of psychiatrist to tell us that. But Trump has also sent a message in a rather indirect form to the Israeli prime minister and the Israeli electorate in the form of reposting an interview that Jeffrey Sachs, the economist who's become a slightly sort of, eccentric thinker, gave to Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, in which Donald Trump spoke in unglowing terms about Bibi Netanyahu, describing him as, I'm saying this from memory, a dark son of a bitch. Are those the words he used?
Did we not talk about my mother and father listening to the
Well, we did,
podcast?
but you can nod or shake. You don't have to use the words, repeat them yourself. But I think that was the broad thrust.
Those are the words, that was the broad phrase.
Yeah. So that is, we had Barak
Mom,
Ravid.
Dad, it was Jonathan using those words, not me.
Yeah, you can do the, you can sort of self-bleep, I always find. You can just say, son of a bee or whatever. Anyway, self-bleep will be our new catchphrase. The point of this is it reminded me, do you remember when we had Barak Ravid on the podcast a while back, when he had these tapes of interviews in which Donald Trump basically said, F Bibi, you see? I just did the self-bleep thing there. That was meant to be in the past. In these recent days, Netanyahu's been going around saying he's been having really good conversations with the president-elect, that the relationship is in really good shape. Now, it's only one button that Donald Trump has pressed by reposting. It's not, these are Jeffrey Sachs's words, not his words, but people will read that as a kind of endorsement by Trump of this dim view of Netanyahu. And also, by the way, Netanyahu says things which are pretty dark themselves, all about the sort of control of the Israel lobby in American politics. He's going down that road a bit. Trump appearing to endorse that. How much should we read into that? Well, I don't know. But when the new president is coming to town, people read the smallest signal, a raised eyebrow here, a flick, of the finger one way or the other. This looks like a negative signal from the incoming president towards a prime minister who prides himself on his relationship with the American leader.
Yeah, and not exactly a man of small signals, Donald Trump. No. But indeed, I mean, when you think of Israelis really are sort of wondering where this is going. So on the one hand, you have Marco Rubio, Lee Stefanik, and of course Mike Huckabee, who's ambassador to Israel, poised to be ambassador to Israel, and to say nothing of Pete Hegseth, who is supposed to be the head of DOD, the Department of Defense, and he was here in 2018 in Israel saying the Israelis should build the third temple. I mean, even Ben-Gvir doesn't say that part out loud. So you have that crowd, but you also have the isolationists, right? The MAGA people. You also have the sort of transactional in this special envoy that is coming into this area. So we don't know where this is heading. The unpredictability, as we talked about a lot, I think can be an advantage or a disadvantage. And I think Israelis are really waiting to see which Donald Trump will step up. And that kind of depends, I think, on the week and the day and not necessarily the whole 4 years.
Yeah. And he likes, I think, keeping people guessing. And this repost of this unflattering remark will certainly do that. I mean, this incoming administration has been throwing its weight around a lot before it has even, got its feet under the table. You see the fall of Justin Trudeau. A lot of people in Canada, a lot of people reading that as a sort of knock-on effect of the fact that he was clearly on the wrong side of the president elect. Elon Musk, who's this big pal of Donald Trump's, he even has this official governmental role, is stamping his feet in German politics. Big endorsement and sort of event coming up with the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland party, and also training his fire on the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. It all adding up to an administration that is just making a whole lot of waves. Donald Trump Jr. going to Greenland, saying we're going to take it, more or less, is the message from his dad. It just feels like this is an administration that is throwing its weight around and in multiple directions. And I think people who care about the, Israel piece of that, buckle up, because you don't know which way this roller coaster is going to roll.
Yeah, and I would add two things. One, the Mark Zuckerberg story of the week, right? When him actually saying that Meta is done with fact checking. A lot of people see that as a nod, a very clear nod in the direction of Donald Trump. You mentioned Justin Trudeau. We should just say, we'd add to that. We do discuss all things Israel and Jewish. We should say that many in the Jewish community had their own things to say about the mishandling, what they saw as mishandling of the rising anti-Semitism in Canada. And they had a lot to say about Justin Trudeau. I think we might talk about that in our next episodes. But I think it's time to move to our special guest.
All the way through the last 14 months, we have been talking about how Israel is fighting this war, the rights and wrongs of it, the merits or otherwise of the way it's prosecuting this war. We've also just now talked about how important the American view of that has been. There were moments where Joe Biden and his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and others were trying to sort of put the brakes on different aspects of the way Israel fought this war. We've talked about that, but we have rarely had a chance to speak with someone who is absolutely expertly placed to offer that view and who is really listened to on matters of warfare and geopolitics.
General David Petraeus is regarded as one of the most admired military strategists in the world. He was director of the CIA. He served over 37 years in the U.S. military as commander of the coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and commander of the U.S. Central Command. His new book, which he co-wrote, is a New York Times bestseller called Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza. Thank you for talking to us.
Great to be with you, Yonit.
You write in the introduction to the book that it is an attempt to show how militaries around the world have learned or failed to learn from each previous war when trying to fashion the means to fight the next. And I'm going to use that quote from your book to ask you, generally speaking, what has Israel learned or failed to learn from the U.S. specifically in waging a war this complicated in urban warfare? And of course, I'm relating specifically to Gaza.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't limit it just to Gaza because I think that what Israel has done, and I wouldn't say that it's Israel learning from the U.S. or even other countries. Israel has learned itself a great deal, although obviously on October 7th, it sustained the worst day in Israeli history. This was the worst intelligence failure, and there are many others to compete with it, including the Yom Kippur War. It was the worst military readiness failure. The response to it was wholly inadequate. And it was the worst, in many ways, political miscalculation at the very top of the Israeli political structure, and frankly, the military structure as well. There was a sense that Hamas was becoming, to a degree, a reasonable neighbor, that it was appreciative of the additional worker visas, that there was a way forward. And of course, it also stemmed from the attempt to build up Hamas as a competitor, obviously, to the other major political entity within the Palestinian Authority. And that proved to be a pretty big miscalculation as well. But since then, in many respects, what Israel has done has been extraordinary. The campaign against Hezbollah is truly one for the ages. This is the best supply chain operation, the most diabolically clever since the Trojan horse, and probably better than that in many respects, because it just didn't decapitate the leadership of Hezbollah, it decimated it. It also destroyed the command control communications means that was left to it after first blowing up the pagers that killed or wounded in particular, thousands and thousands of the senior leaders of Hezbollah. And then the next day, of course, the walkie-talkies, which were the final means of communication, having already given up their cell phones by Hezbollah leaders, they blew up as well. And this enabled a masterful campaign. It prevented Hezbollah from being able to orchestrate and command and control the kind of operation that we almost feared, which was a massive strike by Hezbollah, missiles, rockets, drones, all together that could have overwhelmed the sophisticated air ballistic missile defense of Israel. And then over the course of a number of weeks, with a huge air campaign, took down the capacity of Hezbollah from somewhere around 150,000 projectiles to probably now well under 25,000. And then with the serendipitous overthrow of the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime, this now changes the dynamics in the region dramatically and makes the ability of Iran to resupply Hezbollah through Iraq, through Syria, and down into the Bekaa and southern Lebanon much, much more difficult, if possible at all. And then also, I think, going quite effectively against the Houthis in Yemen, something we should have done long ago together, but now seem to be doing much more effectively. All that said, and noting again the extraordinary use of AI, the intelligence that was built up over really a period of decades, since 2006 at the least, on Hezbollah leadership, on their stockpile locations, the command and control systems, et cetera, and the damage that they've done, of course, to Iranian infrastructure in Syria. At the end of the day, the area in which I think they have not learned as effectively from what we did in the past, and you may have seen that I actually co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs about this, is in Gaza. They've done very, very well in degrading Hamas, certainly a great deal of destruction and loss of innocent civilian life, but in an urban setting and with the massive underground infrastructure, over 350 miles of tunnels, including absolute military machine facilities underground, a lot of that was inevitable. But degradation is not what Israel sought to do. As Prime Minister Netanyahu laid out, there were three objectives of this operation. I'll contend that there should be a fourth as well. The first, of course, is destruction of Hamas. That actually has not been achieved. Again, massive degradation. But if you clear and leave, if you go in, conduct raids, and then pull back out, or have just limited infrastructure inside Gaza, you cannot prevent Hamas from reconstituting its personnel strength at the least. Now, they can't rearm them because Israel wisely has taken control of the Philadelphia corridor, the southern border between Gaza and Egypt, the only portion of the perimeter of Gaza that it did not control before, and of course the Rafah crossing. And it's through that crossing in the south and through the tunnels underneath the southern border that an awful lot of the weapons, ammunition, explosives, other materiel for the establishment of the military capacity of Hamas flowed. And that's denied. But you can't keep them from reconstituting people, and they may be expending the ordnance that they have, et cetera, but they are still there. They're not militarily effective in terms of companies, battalions, brigades, the way they were on October 7th, but they're still effective as insurgents, as guerrillas, whatever term you may want to use. And I don't really think that Israel is pursuing the right campaign design to combat an insurgency, which would be a counterinsurgency, which should be clear, hold, and build. However challenging that is for a force that is modest in size, largely dependent on reserves, doesn't want to do this. We don't want them to do it, which I think is foolish, et cetera. So this is a very big deal. And then, of course, they also set out to prevent Hamas from ever governing Gaza again. I think that is partially successful. Obviously, there's no structured government. Whatever may be left, again, is remnants. It is the equivalent of militarily ineffective, but they are still influencing Gaza in the sense that Gaza is being run now by guys with guns, essentially criminal elements, Hamas remnants, Palestinian Islamic Jihad remnants, and so forth. And then the third objective is to get the hostages back. That obviously has not yet been achieved either. And I doubt, frankly, it's going to be achieved by diplomatic arrangements. There may be another dozen or 2 dozen or whatever released with the attendant release of 10 times that of Hamas detainees. But whether that's a good bargain in the end, noting obviously the enormous heartbreak, pain, and so forth of the families of those who are presumed still alive in or even dead in the territory. And then I think there should be a fourth objective, and I think this is a glaring absence, and that is to provide a better future for the Palestinian people in Gaza without Hamas influencing that future. That would, of course, require, again, security. Without security, you have nothing. There's a famous saying from one of the iconic figures of the Vietnam War that security may be maybe 10% of the problem or 90% of the problem. Whatever it is, it's the first 10% of the first 90%. Without that, you cannot provide humanitarian assistance in an organized way. We see that repeatedly. You can't restore basic services. You can't get the people into better shelter near their homes, ideally. You can't have, again, the beginnings of the introduction of ideally Palestinian security forces that we should have been training at the Jordan International Police Training Center since the very beginning. And you won't get Arab forces to come in or contractors or NGOs in an organized fashion either. And that, I think, is a glaring absence. I understand a good bit why that is. I think that the right-wing coalition, the hard right part of the coalition of the prime minister is not very enthusiastic. I think the population in general, because of the extraordinary trauma that Israel experienced on 10/7, keep in mind that this is the equivalent in our population numbers, noting that we lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. This would be the equivalent of losing 40,000 Americans and having 7,000 taken hostage. So we have to keep that in mind, and you have to understand the implications of that trauma. Nonetheless, there has to be a differentiation between the Palestinian people in Gaza and Hamas, PIJ, and the other extremist elements that are there, which, by the way, I view as the equivalent of the Islamic State, which is to mean they are not reconcilable. One hopes that the rest of the population might be reconcilable. What I can say, I think, with some confidence, is that without a provision of a better future for the Palestinian people, in Gaza. There is no possibility of Gazans living side by side with Jews in Israel in a peaceful manner. There's no guarantee that the world's most perfect counterinsurgency campaign in Gaza would produce that, but I think it provides the best opportunity for that. And without that, again, I think the future for the Palestinian people in Gaza is beyond dire.
I want to follow up just this point about the separation as a goal of the Palestinian people in Gaza from Hamas and PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and what form that might have taken if that had been the goal. I spoke actually with one of your colleagues, I think probably a figure who served under you at one point, who was really quite specific about that, how you separate the people from the enemy, as it were. And he talked about, for one thing, you use much sort of, in effect, lighter ordnance. You don't hit them as heavily, fewer of these, massive bombs, more targeted, lower capacity. But he also talked about aid coming in immediately as a military tactic, so that the minute you've cleared an area, you instantly come in with, this was his idea, food and medicine and so on, and saw it in very hard-headed military terms. That was his view. But I'm just interested what your view of how very practically, I know you mentioned clear, hold and build. It might be worth explaining to our audience what that means. Sure. But also how very practically if it be done properly, and maybe it's not even now too late, Israel could have gone about separating. Well, good. Sure. How it could go about separating those two.
Yeah, so it's very straightforward, actually. You do very similar to what we did in, say, Fallujah, Ramadi, Baquba, Mosul, Baghdad, and so forth. You create gated communities, we call it, with an entry control point. And then the people that are allowed to be in there have biometric ID cards. By the way, Israel's phenomenal at biometrics. They'll identify the vast majority of Hamas that are trying to masquerade as innocent civilians. And this would be very, very useful. But the way to do it, I think, in Israel's case, and in the case of Gaza, would be to start in the north, just simply come in a mile in or whatever based on the terrain, come a mile in, do a wall east-west, that's 12 to 15 miles at the most, given it's a very narrow territory, and then do 2 or 3 north-south walls. And by the way, we used to throw up walls of this size every single night in multiple locations around Baghdad and, again, Fallujah. I think Fallujah, we created 12 or 13 gated communities in a city of roughly 300,000 people. Now, by the way, I want to point out again, Gaza is the most diabolically challenging urban terrain in history, I believe. It's equivalent. There's a couple of cases that perhaps have some equivalency in World War II, maybe even in the case of Mariupol with the steel factory that had similar underground infrastructure and so forth. But this is on a different scale. The millions of people, again, not hundreds of thousands. Nonetheless, you do it the same way. And so you build those walls, you clear everything painstakingly within that area. And that includes every building, every floor, every room, every tunnel entrance. You're going to have to work out the tunnels and how you, again, deny use of those over time because you don't want to entomb people in them. And that's a diabolically challenging problem as well. But this is doable. The challenge, of course, is that we had very substantial forces. We had 165,000 Americans in uniform alone, plus a similar number of contractors, which enabled us to thin out those doing rear area tasks to enable them to be outside the wire doing what only they could do, which is engage the enemy and the population. Israel's wholly dependent on reserves for that, any kind of substantial numbers, as you know well. But it is doable. And once you've cleaned it, once you've cleared it, then you cut entry control points into each of those gated communities from the northern border to the northern periphery there, perimeter, and you then can provide organized humanitarian assistance immediately. You can do it with NGOs now, just escorted by the Israelis, which you cannot do until you've cleared and held an area. You have to hold it. You have to stay there. You can then begin the restoration of basic services. You can begin to introduce, I think, then Arab forces and civilians and organizations might be willing to come in. They're not going to come in until there is security, nor will Palestinian security forces say, trained at the Jordan International Police Training Center or brought over the reliable ones from the West Bank or something like that. So you have a world of possibilities. If you have security, you have really no possibilities without it. And we've seen this, that these World Food Program and other organizations go into Gaza, and in many cases, they're hijacked at gunpoint very quickly. The drivers get out, others get in, and the food is taken to a warehouse controlled by a criminal entity or remnants of Hamas or PIJ. So, and again, then you rinse and repeat. You keep doing this. Now, it gets very difficult around Gaza City, obviously a city of more than 1 million people. You're going to have to slice and dice that based on existing walls, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's much more challenging because of the underground infrastructure that is vastly more. It dwarfs all of that of the Al Qaeda, Sunni insurgents, and even Shia militia had in all of the battles that we fought in Iraq, the urban battles. Nonetheless, again, I don't see any alternative to this if you truly want to achieve the objectives laid out to begin with, those first three that I mentioned, much less the fourth one, which is to provide a better future for the Palestinian people. And again, you have entry control points to the rest of Gaza, through which you then push the forces that are then going to clear the next bit. And you just keep on going all the way down from north to south. It'll be a slow process. There will be casualties, but there are still casualties right now. Not on quite a daily basis, but very close to that. 3 were killed just recently in northern Gaza. And this is going to keep happening unless it is actually that the territory is secured. And I think inescapably in the manner that I have described. And then if you control the entire perimeter, and they should not give up the southern border, and I think they're determined not to do that. They should not give up control of the Rafah crossing. Then you can actually achieve security, and then you can go about, again, bringing in reasonable Palestinian security forces, hopefully reliable, that will be able to maintain the security, and with a watchful eye of Israeli forces who should stay in there, but not in sort of, they need to live with the people, which was the big change with the surge in Iraq. In fact, we did go from clearing and leaving to clearing, holding, and building with the advent of the surge, something we'd not been doing. We'd been consolidating on large bases, driving through the neighborhood a couple of times a day, which was ineffective because it ceded the night to the Al Qaeda in Iraq and Sunni insurgents and Shia militia in other areas.
Sadly, I should say, as an Israeli, I think the main difference is that the world would give the United States as much time as it needs, and for Israel, it pretty soon is saying, you got to wrap this up, this war in Gaza. So that might be problematic because what you're
Well,
describing
this would help
might
though.
take a long time. Okay.
If you announce this, I think you extend the half-life. I think Israel could actually regain support of some of those countries that have been very impatient about what is going on in Gaza and does not see a better future for the Palestinian people, and that being a very big concern for them. And we did this before we went into Fallujah. We told the people of Fallujah through a variety of means, we are coming in. We're going to improve your lives, and we're going to do it by getting Al Qaeda out of those lives. And we're going to then maintain that situation by living with you. And we're going to create a series of gated communities to do that. We actually walled off the entire city. We seized the hospital first. By the way, we secured the entire hospital for 2 reasons. One, we could then help take care of any civilian casualties, and those are inevitable. But also, we could ensure that Al Qaeda would not control it and send out inflated casualties and all the rest of this, and couldn't use it for their own casualties. So,
I mean, what you're saying there, if I may, is that the political goal that a lot of people have been demanding politically, that Israel have a strategy that actually offers a horizon politically to the Palestinian people. You're not just saying that's politically smart. You're saying that's militarily necessary.
yes, actually, I think it's right from all respects, if you will. It does provide a political vision. But again, if you don't do what I've just laid out, the future, again, for these civilians who are living in very flimsy shelter, have been pushed all over Gaza, have seen very substantial casualties and so forth. the bulk of which certainly are Hamas, but still very considerable civilian loss of life and injury as well, that they're sort of consigned to what is described as a humanitarian disaster.
Mhm. How does the most optimistic vision of the day after look like to you? How do you build that from the point that we are at right now? Because it hasn't, I mean, Israel, as we said, has not brought, because of the political constraints, has started thinking about this earlier. What is the best case scenario now?
Well, the best case scenario would be that this afternoon, our time,
Mm.
there's an announcement in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem that there is a commitment to making the lives of the Palestinian people in Gaza better. And here's how
Mhm.
we're going to go about and do it. And by the way, it also will help achieve the three initial conditions that I laid out, which are the ones stated by Prime Minister Netanyahu: destruction of Hamas, just not massive degradation, um, recovery of the hostages, and ensuring that Hamas never governs or really influences activities within the territory again.
It just goes to the question Yonit said about the world's patience and the way the world has reacted to this. And I'm thinking particularly of the International Criminal Court issuing warrants for the arrest of the then Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, and the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, for their conduct of this war. I'm interested in your perspective as a general and as somebody who's been in this situation of fighting insurgency, and you say this situation is even harder than the ones you encountered.
It's incomparable.
So what is it in that? So what is your view of the legitimacy or not of those ICC warrants?
I, I have to defer this. I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not an international criminal court expert or an international law expert, and I'll defer that to those who are.
Mhm.
Again, I think, by the way, Yoav Gallant, ironically, because I had conversations with him about this, both in Israel and then subsequently, he understood that there was a need to provide a political future. You'll recall he called for that. Actually, he said,
Mhm.
"We want," and as did the
Yeah.
chief of staff, said, "We need uh, the desired end state." You know, the military, you always want to know, okay, I got what you want us to achieve, but why do you want us to achieve it? So it's
Mm.
a task or a series of tasks and purposes.
Yeah.
And without a political vision for Gaza, the effort, the task for the military, the mission, if you will, is incomplete. He knew that,
Mm.
the military knew that, and ironically, of course, that's one reason why he was dismissed. And I think he was also very conscious. I talked to him about this in Tel Aviv, very conscious about the need to avoid needless civilian casualties. But you know, early on, in particular, the challenges of this war were very, very substantial. And here's where you have to come back to what Israel experienced and put it in American terms. Look what we did in the wake of 9/11, which was to invade essentially two countries, topple two regimes, et cetera, et cetera. Enormous expenditure of blood and treasure, along with coalition partners. So again, I think it's very important to put this into context in that regard. And but I'll defer the legalistic stuff
Yeah.
to others who are more expert on this than I am.
Yeah, by the way, we should mention that in your book, there's a whole chapter, chapter 10, about the war, and you do talk about the sort of the sadism and the atrocities on October 7th. You call the terrorists, if I'm not mistaken, Islamists Eisenskulpen, just to
Well,
clarify
this is
how
barbaric.
terrible, what a trauma, yeah,
Yeah.
how terrible that trauma was. I would want to talk to you, if we can, about Iran, which on the one hand, obviously, this year saw it having the, I don't know if to call it audacity or chutzpah or, brazenness to attack Israel directly. On the other hand, has seen its most
A
important
colossal
ally,
mistake, of course.
and that turned out to be a colossal mistake, but it did dare do it twice. On the other hand, of course, seeing Hezbollah, its most important proxy and ally, as you said, horribly crippled by Israel. Where do you assess the intentions of this regime, and if Israel would want to, right now in this interim, because that is the discussion happening in this country, to attack Iran's nuclear sites? Would you say that that could lead to a positive development in the region?
Well, I think it's very important to recall what is publicly known
Mm.
about Israel's ability, which it has demonstrated very impressively, and particularly Both responses to the attacks from Iranian soil on Israel, unprecedented, were masterful. The first one, which demonstrated that they could penetrate the airspace in an area, Esfahan, that has several nuclear facilities, and they actually went after the air base to demonstrate this, was, I thought, very, very thoughtful, precise, etc. The second, after that one, again, a really impressive response, which took down, degraded very dramatically, destroyed some of and degraded the rest of Iran's Russian sophisticated air and ballistic missile early warning and defense system. That, by the way, is fantastic because Russia obviously doesn't have any of these to spare. They're more than preoccupied with what's going on in Ukraine. They also couldn't come to the rescue of Bashar al-Assad, needless to say. And now the airspace is open. And by the way, they did this with manned aircraft. Again, very effective, showing that the F-35 presumably is very effective in that airspace. The challenge for Israel is that, again, all publicly known, they do not have the munition, the massive ordnance penetrator, nor a plane that can carry that munition, which is necessary to destroy one of the sites, the one that is deeply buried inside a mountain. Only the U.S. does. So, okay, yep, they could do a huge amount of damage to the rest of the nuclear program, probably destroy just about all of it, damage any that they don't destroy. But again, there will be one particular facility that probably is impenetrable. There are other schemes for how, I don't want to get into that kind of stuff. But by and large, this is an operation that probably should be pursued together with the United States or even led by the United States, which of course has an arsenal of means that don't require penetrating the airspace initially. And when that is done, after having taken down whatever remaining air and ballistic missile early warning and defense systems exist, and the means to retaliate and all the rest of this stuff and lay mines, and this is not a small operation. I should just note, again, publicly known, that the operation was planned when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, and it's publicly known that we conducted a rehearsal of the operation one time when we thought it might be imminent or possible inside the United States airspace, which required laps for some of the aircraft that were going to be used in that operation. We actually set the theater one time. We put all the munitions in, had all the bed down, water, food, all the assets that you would need. So again, this is a big deal. It's probably not something the U.S. will do either, but with the existing administration. In fact, there's a public story about this today that the options have been laid out for President Biden, but probably not exercised unless the Iranians enrich to weapons-grade uranium, something they're a turn of the centrifuges from doing, but have not yet done. And I don't think the next administration necessarily will do that, although I was reassured to hear President-elect Trump say already that we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I think that's very, very important. I hope that it deters that development. Again, you can make a case for taking advantage of this interim period of the vulnerability of Iran, but I don't think that Iran's going to be able to shore up its defenses or improve other aspects. I should also note that, of course, Israel managed to dramatically damage the ability of Iran to make solid fuel rockets, reduced it from making, say, several rockets, engines a day, to one a week, which is very considerable as well. I think we should also keep in mind that while Iran's capabilities have been dramatically reduced, and their most important proxy has been degraded enormously, and they will not be able to rebuild it, of course, that being Hezbollah, its other proxy, Hamas, dramatically degraded, not yet destroyed, but degraded. And of course, the corridor, the country, the regime that allowed them to move materiel across Syria has obviously been overthrown as well. And again, we can have maybe cautious optimism about the outcome there, or guarded optimism, whatever we may describe. We need to watch that very closely. We should be enabling and encouraging and nudging HTS in Syria to be as inclusive and open, to be a government of all the people and for all the people to the greatest extent possible, and not some offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that would be very problematic for the countries in the region.
And there's definitely a question to ask about one of the other proxy armies of the Iranians, and I think we'll get onto that. But just before we leave the nuclear question, you mentioned that you didn't believe the outgoing administration or the incoming administration were minded to activate the plan that you were involved in sort of rehearsing for targeting those nuclear sites. What you didn't tell us is what your advice would be if incoming President-elect Donald Trump picked up the phone and said, should I, not will I, but should I use this hiatus, this interim of Iranian weakness to get at the Iranian nuclear capacity, not through negotiation, but through force? If you, General Petraeus, were asked that question, given your experience of this region, what would you say?
I think it's a very, very close call. In some respects, I sort of like to see this happen. I mean, again, it's a huge threat. They're very close. They're a threshold nuclear power right now. It's again, when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, it was a matter of months. And again, we were very confident we'd be able to identify any movement towards weapons grade, et cetera, et cetera. Then it was extended to over a year with uh, the nuclear agreement with Iran, albeit with sunset clauses and some concerning elements within that agreement, which presumably were what led the then Trump administration to withdraw from it. But of course, Iran, after waiting a year to see if things might change, then began enriching to a measure that they've never reached before. So again, there's a real temptation to go after this. But I think there are some other realities out there. One is I think there's a very considerable debate ongoing within Iran between the regime hardliners, and I wouldn't call them moderates at all, but the less hardliners that are actually running the government, if you will, the president, the parliament, and so forth, noting that there's really two different governments in Iran. There's the regime, the hardliners, it's the Revolutionary Guards, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, the Quds Force. Again, they're crossed between JSOC, the Central Command, and the Assistant Secretary for Mideast, because they have policy as well as Qasem Soleimani explained to me one time when he sent a message to me during the Battle of Basra when we destroyed the Iranian proxy elements within Iraq.
Mhm.
So again, there's that dynamic going on, and we need to see how that plays out. And there's also perhaps an opportunity for a deal. And given President Trump's um, constant aspirations for deals, I think it's probably worth at least trying to see if there could be meaningful dialogue, meaningful negotiation. I don't know how long I'd play around with that. And I certainly wouldn't hesitate if there was any inclination that they're going to enrich to weapons grade. So again, I think it's more complicated than just saying do it. I think there are some other factors that are in play here, other elements, and I think it's worth getting into office, seeing what might be possible, discussing it with Israeli counterparts, Gulf state counterparts, others in the region. Ideally, there would be a degree of consensus among those who matter to us in the region. Um, but again, if they make a move, we need to be absolutely ready to go, and I'm sure that Central Command is.
I think that was a very clear answer on that. You talked about the Houthis at the beginning of our conversation. You said what is done now should have been done a long time ago. And speaking here as the Israeli that's been waking up a few times in the
Yes.
last couple of weeks because of these missiles coming in from Yemen, what is obviously Israel is not alone in this, but what is Israel and its allies supposed to do against this threat? How to crush this? One of the more unexpected turns of this past year and a half.
Well, I think they need to be hammered a lot more than just defensive measures and retaliation against the specific capabilities that have been carrying out the attacks that have been terrorizing shipping in the Red Sea, forcing somewhere around 70 to 75% of it to go around Africa rather than through the Suez Canal. By the way, huge hit to the fiscal situation in Egypt. And I think we have started to do that. Again, I think it took too long. I think one of the challenges this administration has often had is over deliberation, as with providing various capabilities to Ukraine as well. We always provide them in the end, but months later than they should have been originally provided. Israel, I think, has helped spur this. They've conducted multiple substantial air campaigns against not just the assets that are carrying this out, the immediate command and control, but now right into Sana'a to the airport, going after leadership. I think we should put the leadership at big time threat. Again, they're the ones that are orchestrating this, and they need to be targeted. So again, we've had sort of this slow escalation instead of just going after them. Frankly, what Israel did with Hezbollah when it decided to begin that campaign, I think demonstrated that you can't just ping, ping, ping. You've got to go, and that which they did do necessarily while they were focusing on Gaza. You can have one main effort at a time. But when they shifted focus to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, really a very, very substantial campaign that was enabled enormously by, of course, the devastation, not just decapitation, but decimation of the Hezbollah leadership, and then the destruction of their command, control, and communications means. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more of that in this case. Tragically, we should have done that when the Emiratis, in particular, and their proxy forces and special forces were poised to take the port of Hodeidah some years back, again, during the second Obama administration. And again, this is an opportunity to deal with them. I actually wish we had dealt with them all the way back when I was the Central Command commander, and they first appeared to threaten Yemen and to pull apart what had been put together and then maintained, admittedly, by a fairly authoritarian figure. I tend to believe if we had done that way back when, that we would be far better off now, but we didn't. We missed an opportunity, and then we didn't sufficiently support our Emirati and Saudi partners the way that we should have.
I wonder if, and this might be our closing question, if we could ask you about something closer to home for you, and I'm thinking of the incoming president. People around the world, certainly in in Britain and in Europe, when they're asked to list the things that make them worried and anxious about global stability, they list the United States under Donald Trump. And even quite serious sort of people involved in the security establishment in this country privately will tell you that. And I just wondered, again, your assessment, somebody who knows about the military, about strategy and geopolitics. Should the world outside the United States be frightened of this mercurial, unpredictable figure, Donald Trump, who we've seen once before, we've listened to some of what he says, or are you more sanguine about the prospects of a second Trump presidency?
Well, there's just too many unknowns here right now, with one exception, and that's the one that you highlighted, which is the unpredictability that is part of his approach to foreign policy, really even to all policies, and a degree of its times threats. Are these various tariff policies that he has put forward, are they for real, or are they negotiating leverage with, again, including our closest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, as well as, of course, China and so on, our NATO allies, all these different issues. And of course, there's a view, you can make an argument, which he does, that unpredictability has some virtues, tariffs have some virtues, et cetera. The problem with that when it comes to the unpredictability element is that can be okay if you're not in a crisis. So it's called pre-crisis deterrence or diplomacy. But if you get into a crisis, you actually don't want the other side to think that you're unpredictable, because the other side may therefore take action first, um, thinking that you will do something that is, again, unpredictable and might be particularly dire for them. So there can be an argument for a degree of virtue of this, some positive features, but not once you get into a crisis in general. But there were examples of this. Remember, when it comes to the Middle East, for example, that President Trump chose not to respond after the Iranians shot down a $150 million American drone over the Strait of Hormuz. And the military is postured to carry out a proportionate response to that. The U.S. didn't respond after a very considerable Iranian attack on the Abqaiq oil facility in Saudi Arabia, which is something like 10% of the world's oil production. It took out about half of that. So again, this took off the market for about 45 days in the end until the repairs were complete, about 5% of the world's oil production. Thankfully, it didn't cause a huge spike because the Saudis indicated very early on that they'd be able to get this back online. But it was something I think many of us thought should have warranted a very significant response jointly with the Saudis. And again, the U.S. chose not to take action. And then one American contractor was killed in Iraq by an Iranian-supported proxy element. And Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force for well over 2 decades, and my most significant nemesis in the Middle East, in 3 or 4 different commands and as director of the CIA, took him out in Iraq, by the way, and also in that same strike took out a very significant Iraqi Iranian proxy leader. So again, there's a degree of unpredictability there, and of course, then after twice threatening to withdraw our forces from Syria, actually did withdraw them on 24 hours notice, which is not the kind of notice you'd want for a well-planned, well-conducted, deliberate withdrawal, but required leaving lots of equipment behind that you can't get out within 24 hours, bombing a base that would put tens of millions of dollars into, because the Russians were threatening to come in the front door as we were going out the back door, et cetera, and then went back in. Several days later, when Senator Lindsey Graham and retired General Jack Keane and some others in the Oval Office convinced him that that's where the oil was in Syria, and we needed to go back in and help our partners there, the Syrian Democratic Forces, ensure control of it. So that feature, again, is, again, one that you can make a case for to a degree. We've seen in the past. And of course, it naturally, I think, should be something that others are concerned about, and even others who are inside the United States. So there are a number of these different elements, but far too soon to really offer any predictions. We know who the National Security Advisor is. We know who the future Secretary of State will be. One doesn't require confirmation. The other will be, I'm sure, confirmed by his fellow former Senate colleagues. They're solid, traditional individuals, but there's going to be quite a debate within the administration as well, I think, between those that are the traditional Republican foreign policy views and those who hold the America First view and so forth. There'll be even more when it comes to issues like international economics and the imposition of tariffs and so on. So that all is going to have to shake out over the course of months, if not years, because we'll recall that President Trump somewhat enjoys this kind of internal wrangling and wrestling and tug of war, and then settles it over time. And I think that's probably what will characterize, which will be different from the current administration, which had familiar faces in every position, every significant position. We'd all worked with Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and of course Lloyd Austin, twice in combat together in Iraq and in peacetime at the 82nd Airborne Division. Again, these are all very familiar individuals. They had generally quite a coherent view of the world. I didn't always agree with it. As I mentioned, there was far too much deliberation about certain actions to support Ukraine. And I disagreed fundamentally with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I felt was quite sustainable in terms of the expenditure of U.S. blood and treasure. And clearly it was a far better situation, however frustrating, maddening, et cetera, our counterparts in Kabul might have been, and the situation in general might have been far, far better than what we see now in Afghanistan. But again, generally a coherent view, generally one that agreed on the need for the United States to provide leadership, did, I think, quite an impressive job pulling together the comprehensive, integrated whole of governments with an S on the end, all our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, a number of other cases as well, and led the world, I think, very impressively in the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in general, albeit with over temporizing on some of the really critical decisions. So a very, very different situation, I think, from the current administration, whether you agree with all or not. I generally agree with a good bit of it, but not all. And the future administration, where there's going to be endless tugs of war and wrestling and wrangling over what the policies are.
Yeah. One thing we can predict, it's not going to be boring even for a minute. General David Petraeus, I mean, we could continue talking to you for hours but and learning from you, but we realize that you are probably a very busy person. So we thank you very, very much for this conversation. We've learned a lot from it. Thank you.
Well, thanks for great questions and a very, very stimulating discussion, Yonit and Jonathan.
So many interesting things that General Petraeus said and shared with us. I mean, one thing actually was something almost he didn't say, and it came in his answer to my question about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and its arrest warrants that are out there for the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, but also for the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant. I mean, very much in our minds this week when, you have an IDF reservist who's there visiting Brazil and has to leave the country for fear that there may be some attempt to prosecute him for war crimes. And so people will have seen that story. But the question I was asking was, what about those at the top level? And I have to say, I was expecting David Petraeus to say that, he as a military man who needs to have sort of operational freedom of, maneuver, that he was just categorically against this move by the International Court. And he didn't quite do that. I mean, instead, what he did was to say that he's not a lawyer and that he's ready to defer to the court. That's a judgment for them. And if you think about what things like people like Joe Biden himself in the Biden administration, they were much more categoric than that. They were condemning of the court, said this was across the line, shouldn't have done this. I didn't quite get that from General Petraeus.
But he did defend Gallant. Like, he did go on to say, like, Gallant is the one who actually wanted a day after plan in Gaza and things like that. Like, he didn't say anything about Netanyahu, clearly. But
yes, and I did notice that too. That was pointed. Mm-hmm. But he didn't just go all the way and saying they had no business doing this. It's a disgrace, And so that surprised me a little bit. He said instead that, that he's not a lawyer. And he was showing in some ways, a respect for the court. But your mention there the day after is the other thing that really leapt out to me about that. Because it seemed to me that there is a kind of chorus that you hear now from such different people who come at this from all kinds of different places, but end up in the same place. So there he is. He's a man of the military. He approaches these things as a soldier in a hard-headed way. He said, as a fourth military goal, there should have been making the lives of the Palestinian people better. The prospect of it and actual, day-to-day material benefits. You think about what, Thomas Friedman, when he was on here, was saying about that, about how you've got to have that kind of political horizon. You need it. And I think about, right at the start when I was banging on about humanitarian aid, it was all about the same thing. You have to make the lives of the Palestinian people better. Otherwise, you will fuse them together with Hamas, whereas as a matter of military strategy, it wasn't an original thought when I had this. I'd spoken to soldiers and former American commanders who said this. To separate out Hamas from the people, you have to offer them that chance of an improved life. And what that means is food, medicine, water, and lower, where you can, you calibrate down the ordnance so their homes are not whole neighbours are not reduced to rubble, etc. And, I thought it was fascinating to hear as a guy who is no, bleeding heart liberal. You heard how he spoke about October the 7th. You heard his condemnation for Hamas. Nevertheless, he lands in that same place. There has to be that political horizon, that prospect of something better for the Palestinians. And I just thought coming from him, that was very striking to me.
But actually, he took it one step forward. And he said for Israel to be able to prolong this war, because what he's talking about is a very long, detailed, meticulous war against Hamas. He actually said for Israel to have that ability to have a long war, this should be part of its strategy. That was very interesting. I'll just add two other things that to me were really interesting. First of all, his enthusiasm in relation to Israel's operations in Lebanon, the pager, he called it a Trojan horse, a modern Trojan horse. He said it was serendipitous. He sounded like he appreciated, valued what Israel was doing against Hizbollah. The other thing was what he said about Iran. When we asked him, is the right thing to do to attack, the nuclear sites, rather? It was interesting how he described Qasem Soleimani as his nemesis. But he also said, part of me, and I thought there was a lot of candor in the whole conversation. He said, part of me would want to see that happen, but we need to be smart and we need to see how the Iranians act and then react to them. Look, this is a man who is a general, soldier. He knows this region inside out. And it was so interesting to listen, to hear from the tiniest details to the big picture, what his analysis of what happened and what can happen, what that analysis is.
Yeah, no, I thought we learnt a lot from General David Petraeus, and it was very, very good to hear him, and especially to have a chance to sort of really develop his thinking at length rather than, some of the shorter conversations that you get in other places. This is one of the joys of a podcast 4 years on, that we can really hear people like him, expound and expand their thoughts. So that was very, very good. We should get to our awards. Before we do that, a mention, and I spell that carefully with Mention.
Yes.
No
one's going to think it's Mensch.
There's no Mensch element here. The passing of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of what was then the Front National, the National Front. It's been renamed now by his daughter. A sort of, you can behave around the edges, but really a fascist leader in France who
Holocaust
famously,
denier, if you want to add.
Who famously said that the Holocaust was a mere detail of the Second World War. That's where he was coming from. There were, other unsavory remarks are available. You'll find those in the obituaries, I'm sure. But he, I remember that day in 2002 when the French electorate learned that the runoff was going to include him, that he'd made it to the final two, and the shock a lot of French people felt that somebody who was an ultra-nationalist, if you prefer that word, chauvinist, maybe that's a good word, but certainly with some fascist instincts, was one of two choices for president of the Republic. What a shock that was. In some ways a harbinger of the kind of politics that we are in now, with, his daughter is once again in that position of being the sort of challenger for political power. But
much more sophisticated and thus much more successful.
Yeah, because she learned to sort of clean up some of the, overt racism and anti-Semitism of her father. I think it is just a sort of airbrush cleanup job. I'm not persuaded of the, depth of sincerity of it, but it's a moment. Jean-Marie Le Pen dying 96 years old. A long, but certainly for France's Jews and Muslims, an unhappy life from their point of view.
So shall we go directly to the Mensch Awards?
Why don't we?
So I'll say this. Look, I don't want to say I wake up every day concerned about AI, but, just to summarize AI, because I think we should have a few conversations about this in the next couple of episodes. But, obviously there's someone smarter than us, right, on the planet, or something smarter than us on planet Earth, and that's freaky. So I would say, 70% of AI is freaky, frightening, but a lot of it is actually helping humanity. And in that column, I would want to put a story that has to do with our network with Channel 12 here in Israel this week. And one of our veteran correspondents that everyone knows and loves, Moshe Nussbaum, who's been the correspondent in the police beat for decades and a wonderful friend and colleague. Moshe was diagnosed with ALS 2 years ago. And little by little, because his speeching has become more and more difficult, that made it impossible for him to be on air. We missed him as his colleagues from the network, the viewers missed him. And he kept coming to work every day, but it was very difficult for him to actually broadcast. And now with AI technology, what is becoming an option, and actually has happened once or twice on air this week, is that together with his own texts and his physical presence in the studio, we managed to create a situation in which he can report as he normally did. I mean, there are questions here, but that I've heard also internally. We've had these debates whether it is a journalistically kosher thing to do. But I think that as long as the viewers do know what is going on, and they do, I think this is a moment in which you can harness this kind of technology to do good. And I mean, we are very happy about it. I hope the viewers are too.
No, that's rather wonderful. And I think in medicine is where AI really does have hugely heartening and sort of, potentially liberating possibilities. And I remember Yuval Noah Harari, when he was with us on Unholy, saying that about medicine, but also making the point that you just made in passing there, which is as long as people know. And I think as long as there's that transparency and disclosure, then there are some wonderful possibilities, and that is wonderful. So I think the AI technology itself won't appreciate being our Mensch of the week. So we say to Moshe Nussbaum himself that he's our Mensch of the week. The AI would be unmoved by this accolade. For Chuzpah, I know that he's our most prolific winner. I know that. And he's going to carry on being, I'm sure. And mind you, he might be in a competition with the Israeli Prime Minister for Chuzpah, serial winner of Chuzpah Award. But I have to give it to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump this week complained about the Biden administration not being helpful enough in the transition. To quote Aaron Sorkin, you think? I mean, sorry, what an unbelievable chutzpah in the week that has seen the 4th anniversary, not just of our podcast, which is upcoming, but of January the 6th, 2021, when, if you want to see difficulty with a transition, storming the Capitol to try and prevent the certification of a full, free and fair election, that's a difficult transition. Not necessarily giving you the keys to the stationery cupboard or whatever the Biden people are accused by Trump of doing. That's not really holding up a transition. But it's amazing about Donald Trump, the brass neck of him, because you almost sense he wouldn't even have thought of it, that what he did 4 years ago was in any way disruptive to a transition. So Donald Trump, for complaining that the Biden people aren't helping him enough, in the very week where Kamala Harris, by the way, was the one who had to certify his win and did it peacefully. There were no nooses around. There were no signs saying, hang J.D. Vance or whatever. They should feel rather grateful, and it is outrageous chutzpah for Trump. But we know this will be the first of many over the next 4 years. He's got something like a season ticket when it comes to our Chuzpah Award.
I don't know, a part of me, and for other reasons as well, kind of wants to see Saudi normalization and perhaps a Nobel Peace Prize for Donald Trump, and you have to put him in the Mensch category. Like, I see that somewhere in the future, but who knows? Because I've already said, I will have no problem doing that. There will be no hat eating, because I will be delighted to do that if that happens. And there are moments where I could sort of, I can see it. But his cabinet, before he gets his Nobel Prize in there, his trophy cabinet already is crowded with Chutzpah of the Week awards from us, and another one is on its way. Indeed. So we're wrapping up our conversation. We'll remind our listeners again of bonus episodes that are available if you're a Patreon subscriber. And we will say our thank you to Michal Porat, and you and I will meet next week.
And we will meet even before then, because we will have our bonus episode Do you get the feeling that I'm pushing this a little bit more than you, Yonit? I get that feeling just a tiny bit.
And it's kind of remarkable since I come from commercial television. Like if someone knows how to do ads and commercials.
So why don't you push what is our next available bonus episode, Yonit?
Our Q&A, which I think has some nice, very smart questions from our listeners, and I hope some nice answers from us.
Yeah, that is available. If you are a subscriber on Patreon, you can hear our Q&A episode. I think it's dropping next Tuesday. So you just sign up on Patreon. You need to go to patreon.com/unholypod, and you can see all the details there of how to become a friend or family member of the podcast. But yes, so we will see, if you're listening to that, you'll get us on Tuesday. Otherwise, we'll see you back here next week on Friday. And remember, watch When Harry Met Sally, because A, it's a brilliant film, and B, when you've seen it, you can enjoy even more our conversation all about why that is perhaps the greatest Jewish, if not Jewish, movie ever made. Anyway, I've got to save it for that episode.
Unholy, the only podcast in the world that also gives you homework. We'll meet next week.
See you then.